Hi, everybody. Are you tired of hearing from me? Especially if you've been in my classes all semester. It's great to be with you. I'm glad you like this Agape Latte thing. Is it clap, snaps, if it's good? It's working? Yeah? We should do it again next year? We should be training for it to happen next year? Okay, good. Teaching the core. I'm teaching the honors program this year. You have my students from the room. Woo-woo. It's like the core, but for like the slower students. So anyway, it's great to be with you and share a little bit. I didn't know what to talk. You know when you get asked to do these things and you're like, oh sure, yeah, that's great. And then you're like, I should think about what I want to say. And you're like, I have nothing interesting in my life to share. Nothing comes to mind. I did think of some things. Don't worry. I'm sure I'll go over. But then I made the mistake. Father Colin, right at the beginning of the semester, he was like really good. Right? Got up there with a weird trench coat and was like actually pretty profound. And then I made the mistake. I couldn't be at the last one because I was traveling for work. But I made the mistake today of listening to Dr. John Larissie, and I was like, oh well, this is really profound and moving. So no promises tonight, but I'm going to do my best. When I was thinking about what I might want to talk about or just share with you, I'm just going to talk about some parts of my life, and if any of it resonates, great, we can talk in the Q&A. But the theme I wanted to reflect on was the need for meaning in our lives. So I think it's a theme that cuts across religious commitments, cuts across political commitments, cuts across different walks and styles of life to something that really touches all of us, I think, deeply if we have time to think about it. Right? We want to believe that there's meaning to our lives, right? Or that our lives are sort of dedicated to a kind of meaning, or that they're going to land somewhere meaningful, right? And the search for meaning, I guess, is more what I want to think about, that our real experience of meaning is something we're sort of like aiming at, right? It's rarely, if ever, something we just kind of arrive at and get to plateau in for the rest of our life, right? But this sort of constant struggle, often a joyful struggle, sometimes not, to find things, to find people, to find beliefs that can sort of support our hope, right? That can sort of support the weight of our lives, of our decisions, of our freedom, that can sort of bear us up over the long haul. And as someone so my PhD is in philosophy, it's what I was trained in. That's sort of what philosophers are after, I think, when they're at their best. We're often not at our best. But when we're at our best, it's a search for meaning, right? Another word for meaning is often truth, right? For truths about what truly matters, about what's truly worthwhile, about what's worth giving myself to, right? All this time and energy, a whole lifetime of opportunity. What are the kinds of meanings that are worthy of me, in one sense, right? As a human being, that I can give myself to, kind of deeply and fully. Anyone read Viktor Frankl in one of your core classes? Man's Search for Meaning? Viktor Frankl, it's a good book. Probably the best. I don't know, I love lots of books. But if I had to recommend one to just about anyone, I would recommend Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl is an Austrian of Jewish descent who's a psychiatrist who's kidnapped, right, and taken into a Nazi prison camp. He actually lives in 3 different prison camps for about a 5-year span. Ends up surviving and writing about his experience and sort of what it taught him about the human need for meaning. Religious meaning included, but kind of meaning in general. And he says, the need for meaning is something that can sort of be put upon us, right? Some of us intuitively get, I want my life to matter, right? I want it to be meaningful. When I say that, I think we're all like, yeah, absolutely. I don't want to live a meaningless life, right? But actually, day to day out, we don't reflect on that very often, right? But certain experiences, I think, drive that reality home for us, right? I think love is an experience, the ideal experience, right? To find something I love, to find someone I love that gives and bestows meaning on my life, a God I love. But I think also what Frankl's insight is, but suffering can do that to us as well, right? The suffering that we can't avoid presents us with an opportunity to think about how it might be meaningful and not only difficult, right? Meaningful and not only tragic. And And for me, that was my way into it. I don't think I was thinking about much as an 11-year-old. But then one day, we were on Easter break, so it's actually coming up on my brother's anniversary. Some of you have heard this, so forgive me. I'm not trying to sort of like monopolize the death of my sibling, but for those of you who haven't, it's a bit of necessary background information. I was across the street playing basketball at my friend's house. Sirens kind of come roaring through the trees. My friend and I run home, and long story short, my 2 younger brothers had been hit by a car. They were riding their bikes. They were 5 and 6 years old. And my youngest brother, Johnny, was unconscious on the front lawn. His older brother, my younger brother, David, had been whisked away with some serious leg injuries to a hospital. And over the next 48 hours, it was this sort of kind of crucial but sort of crushing experience of realizing like he hadn't taken a turn for the better, kind of minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day. And that he was on life support, but he was really brain dead, that the way he had landed had sort of broken him, to put it simply. And so we were given a chance to say our goodbyes, but at the end of the day, he never woke up. I was 11. I mean, you don't process too much at 11, but you process enough. And suddenly, the world was shaded differently than it had been a day and a week beforehand. Right? You're sort of thrust into a world that you're not mature enough to handle, I think, as an 11, as a 12-year-old. A world where you don't kind of understand your parents' grief, right? You're trying to take care of your siblings, and I had a couple other siblings, a brand new baby sister who was like 4 months old at the time. And then parents whose like grief, not that it was there, it was healthy, they shared it with us, but you kind of like, I don't understand that. Like there's this catastrophic devastation that I can only sort of observe from the sidelines that doesn't mirror my own grief as a brother and an 11-year-old, and so then you're sort of like, I don't know, like what is the meaning of all this, right? Does all this make sense? Sort of life was simple, it was straightforward, right? I had my siblings, I had my parents, I had school, we lived on a quiet dead-end street where nothing bad happened ever, and suddenly all that is sort of turned upside down in a few minutes. And so I think that sort of launched me into probably my PhD in philosophy down the road eventually, but certainly in the interim just raised questions for me about God, certainly. I mean, I was raised in a very kind of religious family, and our beliefs were my experience of our beliefs were pretty straightforward at that point, right? God loved us, God took care of us, God saw what you did when mom wasn't looking, and now all of a sudden it's like, well, how can this loving God allow this to happen, right? Isn't this God, if he's really all-powerful and all-knowing, in some way responsible for the death of this little 5-year-old boy, right? The death of my brother. I had those questions. I don't know if I could have formulated them that way, right? But there's a sort of like discordant note in the melody or the soundtrack of your life at that point, right? And for me, it was something that, not always in distress, but that I just had to kind of revisit at different stages of my own development. As I grew older, as I moved into high school and realized that like, oh wow, like I don't have like a dark view of the world, but it's not quite as sort of like simple and happy-go-lucky as my friends, right? Who just want to go kind of hang out and party and do whatever else, right? I mean, I did that, it was fun, but there's just a heaviness to life, I think, after something like that. And it doesn't have to be negative, but it's just different, and you feel different. And so I think that set me on a search for meaning. One of the that led me to a bunch of fun and strange and odd places, and I want to talk about a few of them tonight. One of them was, actually before I went to college, was to Mexico. I had some time between high school and college. I was actually finishing high school a little early. I was just actually planning to work and make some money, because anyone with me, college is very expensive. Even when the government's paying for part of it, it's still really expensive. And I was actually on a retreat, and I don't know, like, I mean, I think I kind of knew who God was, and I tried to pray, and I went to Mass and stuff, but I had this new experience of like almost like a conviction being placed on my heart. Like, oh, I need to actually think about maybe what I should do with these sort of 4 or 5 months between graduating high school and starting college. I didn't know where I was going at the time. And our school had an exchange program with an organization in Monterrey in Mexico. And so I met a bunch of guys my own age who'd kind of come up to study English with us. and like help out around the school and stuff. So I was like, maybe I should go to Mexico. Which of course, as a sophomore in college, I would have known that's where you go for spring break. But as a senior in high school, it was kind of like, what would I do in Mexico? Long story short, I moved down there for 6 months of kind of faith-based service work with an organization, a Catholic organization down there. It transformed my life. I was just talking with Gerald. I mean, a number of us have done probably a week of service, right? When you have like 5 months of service, there's like a lot of time you're not serving during those 5 months, right? Like many hours of the day. And like so many people who've had the same experience, when you serve, you really learn that you don't have much to offer, right? Especially when you move to Mexico with only 2 years of high school Spanish. I mean, I learned very fast, but it still was pretty brutal for the first 2 or 3 months. And what I learned was really how to be vulnerable, right? That like, I don't think I was super naive, but naive enough to think I had something to offer. And in an ultimate way, I suppose I did. But what I really learned was how much I needed other people to care for me, right? And how much learning to be honest about my own limitations, right? The word vulnerability comes from the Latin word for a wound, right? And a wound is sort of a limit, your skin breaking apart, right? And the idea of a wound is it's painful, but it's also a kind of opening, right? And I think what I encountered serving in Monterrey, but then also in a number of other areas around Mexico and Latin America during the 6 months I was there, was how much sort of I needed to be broken open, right? How much I needed to learn my own limits, not as a way of, not as something to be shameful of, right? But really as an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to learn from others. The other thing I learned was, so it was a faith-based organization, so there was time for like prayer, like every day you were supposed to pray. It's like a lot. Am I talking about you? Maybe not. Okay, you're all much holier. And not just like, I mean, obviously Mass is the source and summit of the Catholic faith, but not just like structured liturgical prayer, like go be in a space with yourself and God for like 30 to 60 minutes and like don't fall asleep, right? And I was like 18. I still can't believe my parents let me go, by the way, to Mexico. I like looking back on this now and I'm like, what were you, I mean, it worked out really well, but I think it did anyway. I'm like, what were you thinking? But I think what I learned, so I think I want to make 3 points ultimately tonight. And the first is this: the search for meaning requires an interior life. And I think what I sort of began to learn in a very rough draft sort of way as an 18-year-old in this tiny chapel in the house of a group of sort of celibate men who sort of dedicate their lives to service, where I could pray every morning, was, well, there's like a space inside me, not an emptiness, but a kind of fullness that I can access. And that somehow is the key or a key to living a meaningful life. That it's not only what I hope to do. I was still, tell me, how about this for applying for college? A, I had to use paper. B, all the things were getting mailed to my parents' house in New Jersey, and I was living in Mexico. So every time I got, like, the internet was sort of just starting in the early 2000s when I was in Mexico, I'd get like an email from my dad being like, you need to call home. And so every week it was like, small letter, big letter, what happened, right? And as I'm waiting to kind of learn about my future, thinking that I had big aspirations. Anyone else get rejected from Princeton? It's really like a rite of passage. Oh, right. You too, Johnny? Yeah. Glad to hear it. That small school in southern New Jersey with the Ivy. I was so focused on external things, right? And then our high schools and colleges, our culture train us for this, right? Well, success looks like a GPA number, an SAT score, and the right letter from the right school. And like, I can only see this in hindsight, but really what I was being taught as I encountered my own limitations, trying to serve and really being served by the very people I thought I was going to serve, was that the interior life, right, is the real measure of like human depth, not where your degree's from, and not what major you managed to survive after 4 or 5 years of college, right? But sort of the kind of person you're becoming. but also that becoming isn't always and totally ever up to me, right? We're not our own sort of constructions. We're deeply dependent on the people and environments around us. And so that move to interiority was also a sort of recognition of the importance of other people in my life. If I walked away from my 6 months in Monterrey, Mexico, with anything, it was like with an awareness of how like meaningful human friendships could be. People who sort of, I mean, I was fun, don't get me wrong, but like who met me in my like inability to speak in some sense, right? In my sort of confusion about how I was supposed to be serving others, and sort of welcomed me into their lives, right? My various host families, friends, their families, extended families, tios and tias, this whole community of people who sort of welcomed me into their lives. And really in that way, like, taught me about who I was. I thought I kind of knew who I was and I was going to offer that, and really what I had to do was learn who I was from other people. So interiority, right? Finding this sort of space inside us that, by the way, it's the work of a lifetime to cultivate, right? It's not something you sort of, it's not a place on a map you kind of identify once and know how to get back to, but it requires these disciplines and practices of attentiveness, of silence, right? Of trying to kind of listen, in some ways to your own heart, but also to maybe the voice of God, sort of in the stillness and in the silence. I did get into college eventually, and I moved. I went to the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, small school with a big football problem, and I was like a kid at like a buffet. I was like so excited to like learn all the things, to major, does this sound familiar to anybody? Just me. Major in everything. Literally, I was like music, business, philosophy, English, and maybe theology. I was like, I want to do it all except math. I don't want to do math. I actually, which I really, if you do math, I admire you. I mistakenly thought I wanted to sell my soul to the corporate world and be a business major. And so I willingly, did not have to if I had just known I was going to be an arts and science person from the beginning, willingly took a calculus class in my freshman year. Yeah. Oh, lowest grade I've ever gotten in my life. I will not say it on camera, but it was not pretty. But there was this sort of like, you know, St. Augustine says our hearts are restless until they rest in God, right? That for me it was an intellectual restlessness. Like I'm surrounded, and it certainly is true here too, I'm surrounded by people who want to talk about ideas and things and who care about getting it right? And for whom, maybe unlike some high school teachers who are underpaid and overworked, like they've got time for my questions. They actually want me to come to office hours and like talk to them about the things I think about, or the problem of evil and my brother's death and whether God exists and how we would know that and all these kind of crazy things, right? And it was beautiful and it was transformative for me to be in a community of people thinking about things, right? Doing things too, but thinking about things. And I think what I learned there was that, and there's limits to this, and I realized them in hindsight, but meaning also has to be intellectual. Like our minds need to be engaged to have a meaningful life. A meaningful life can't be achieved on autopilot, right? Or by never examining the convictions you hold, or the beliefs you hold, or the sort of morals and values, the ethics you hold, right? And for me, college was part of it. The best part of it was this powerful experience of like being able to ask questions, right? And being able, in a way that is less possible often in daily life when we have to like make decisions and move on, being able to like sit with questions, right? And like sit sometimes in the turmoil or the tension of a question that I know really matters to me and that doesn't admit of an easy solution, right? But like the two obvious answers on opposite sides, neither of them appeal to me. Like there's some other thing, way, through or forward or around this, and I don't have the answer. And like learning to be okay with that. Not in a like, therefore I'm giving up and none of it matters anyway, right? But in a no, I care very deeply about getting this right. And because I care so deeply about getting it right, it's worth waiting on the right answer. Does that make sense? It's not like nihilism, right? Giving up on the possibility of getting it right, but it's patience with yourself. And really patience with life, because some things in life just don't have easy answers, right? Some realities are just hard or big or wide or deep. And they require patience, or what Simone Weil, a sort of Catholic mystic, says, they require attention, right? Actually, attention in the sense of like, when you attend to someone, like waiting patiently on an answer to emerge and recognizing that I can't always force the answer I need, right? I can't always, wisdom isn't willpower. I can't always make it happen. I have to be patient on it. So let's see if I got through half of what I wanted to say. I don't know if this just came to me, and I don't even know if it's related to what I'm saying, but one very powerful experience I had in my first year, I ended up becoming so I'm a philosophy professor now. I took my first philosophy class in Notre Dame and I hated it. It's I actually did well in it, unlike math. But I was like, this is so boring. It's just like memorizing definitions. And do you even do blue book exams anymore? Is that or green book? Is that still a thing? Okay, Dr. Scully gets a shout out. Writing down these things you memorized the night before and just regurgitating it. And instead there was this weird small major in humanities, basically, kind of great books, this mix of philosophy and theology and political science. And I was like, this sounds fun. They do a lot of reading and they like to talk about it outside of class. These are my people. I'm going to do this. Turns out it's really a philosophy major, just sort of with a different approach. But I took the first seminar and we read the Iliad. Hands, if you've heard of the Iliad? Yes. I know some of you read it with me. And I was sort of wavering between philosophy and literature. I kind of realized math wasn't for me at that point. And there's this scene in the Iliad where one of the heroes, Hector, has died, and the other hero on the opposite side, Achilles, has sort of defamed or desecrated his body and taken it back to the warring camp, right? Hector's dad, Priam, is the king. And he's powerful, he's safe behind his walls, but he risks everything in humility to go weep before Achilles and beg for the body of his dead son. And just sort of lay himself out before this vengeful hero in an appeal to his common humanity to be allowed to bury his child, right? And I'm sure in part because of my own previous experience background, but I was like, this is so real. There's something so human in this half, maybe totally fictional, story from ancient Greece that I'm not finding in my science and philosophy classes, which are very good and very important. It's not to sort of draw a contrast, or it is to draw a distinction and say, but something resonated for me in literature and philosophy and theology that felt authentic. It felt like it didn't shy away from the parts of life that you couldn't fit in a neat definition or a well-formed formula or logical proof. And that life, this search for meaning, was deeply meaningful, but it was also really messy. And that sometimes the rough edges didn't just disappear when you found the right answer, right? They were still there and you still had to contend with them. Looking back though on that time, I do think the intellectual life can also be a danger or a temptation. It's actually absolutely essential to who we are, but it can tend to be isolated. Right? It can tend to get wrapped up in itself, either overconfident in itself or kind of turned in on itself, where only my questions matter, or they only matter to me. And I think moving out of that into, I worked in New York City for a while, I taught for a while, and eventually went back to grad school, was learning that a community is essential, right? That interiority, sort of personal depth and reflection, intellect, right, being honest about your questions and passionately pursuing their answers, not settling for easy answers that come too quickly, are essential, but they're not enough. That we really need other people to flourish. And that our search for meaning is never so personal that we can't invite other people into it, right? And our search for meaning is never so personal that it doesn't presuppose a community of people, right? Who support us, who challenge us, right? Who call us to account, but also who love us in the midst of our vulnerabilities and limitations. And that's, I think, if I look back on grad school where all you do is think, I don't know if I can even recommend it in good faith. I mean, I did enjoy parts of it. But actually, when I think about grad school, what actually got me through it were my friendships, which I don't think I appreciated at the time, right? The people who stayed up late and crammed and wrote 3 20-page papers in a week. Am I talking about people? Seniors do that here, right, at least? You hit the 20-page mark. Who had a porch beer with you, right, when you were spiraling and wigging out, right, over whether or not you were going to pass a class or something. that they were intellectual friendships in a way. Some of them were also friendships of people I actually lived with or shared faith with. But like those people were as important as the classes I was taking. And I think that's true, I hope, of our undergraduate experiences too, right? That we're here to get a degree. That's not actually why we're here, but I know you all think that, so we'll just work with that for now. Like I'm here to get a degree, to get a job. Hopefully along the way I develop some habits of reflection and care and love for others. But actually the people I walk through this time with matter as much or more, and often teach me as much or more. And teach me lessons that I'm more likely to carry with me, good and bad, right? And so what am I doing on time? I have so much more material, but I'm not going to give it all to you. I'll save some for the next talk. Friendship matters, and I think college it's a strange time, right? Like everyone you see is like 18 to 25. I mean, if you think about that, like on the green, right? How many of you seen like a baby on campus? Am I wrong? But there are lots of them, right? They exist. They're just not here, like your grandparents, right? There's no old people on campus, or very few of them, right? Some of those professors who just won't retire and give us their tenure track jobs. Right? There are very few old people here. This is a really strange environment. It's artificial, right? It's in the sense of it's man-made, right? That we're like, oh look, here's a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds who all want lots of freedom and no rules. Let's put them in houses together and give them a cafeteria, right? And yet, so many things happen inside you, right, over these 4 years. And that can be, let's be honest, right, that can be deeply damaging. It's probably always a mix of good and bad, but it can also be really beautiful and powerful and profound. And I think finding time for these three things, finding silence in your day, in your week, maybe at least in your semester, to begin exploring your own interior life. Like, what are my desires, right? What do I hope for? Really, not what my business or my law or my English professor told me to hope for, right? But like, what does like my heart orient me towards? What are the kinds of things that stir it, right? That make it restless in the right kind of way and not the wrong kind of way. Certainly intellectual rigor, like taking your classes seriously, right? You may not have to think about math ever again, unless you're doing the tip on the bill. But you will have to think for the rest of your life, God willing, right? Actually, use your brain to problem solve all the time, day in and day out, personally, publicly, professionally, right? You're going to be thinking all the time. The more that you can hone those skills, the more peaceful your life might be moving forward. But then lastly, and in some ways most importantly, to seek out meaningful relationships, right? To stay committed to the ones you have, right? How many of you should call your parents tonight? Check in. But also to friendships, right? To really lean in to good relationships. And sometimes, I teach a course on philosophy of friendship, so I'm sorry if some of you have had it before. But to kind of evaluate, not in bad way, but just what are the relationships in my life that are life-giving, right? That actually teach me something. I don't know, sometimes I'm oversharing now, but you look around and you're like, is this like a collection of friends? I wanted this kind of friend and that kind of friend and this kind of friend. I have this nice little collection of people who are not like me or maybe who are like me, and that sort of works for my image of what I want my life to be, right? But real friendships aren't people who fulfill sort of your expectations. They're anyone who has a capacity to love you, right? Well. And that's really what we're after, right? And people who demand, or in their own just way of being with me, kind of pull out of me a desire to love them well, right? And the philosophical definition of love is just to will the good of the other, right? Who simply want my happiness in some way. And I think if you can leave 4 years, maybe 5, maybe 6 if you're doing a 3+3, of time at Seton Hall, of time anywhere, having deepened your interior life, having become more intelligent, and having learned how to love people well, right, as friends, then you've really gotten an education, right? And you're on your way, I think, to living a meaningful life, right? To searching well for meaning. Viktor Frankl says, we all want happiness, but the funny thing about happiness is we can't decide to be happy. It's not merely a matter of choice, right? I'm feeling really bad today, and I'm just going to decide I'm going to be happy. Does that work for you? Anybody have that much willpower? or just like magic, like light switch, I'm happy? No, right? That doesn't work. That's not how we're wired. Our emotional life is more complex than that, right? More complicated than that. But what he says is, happiness, you can't pursue happiness, right? Go after it as your goal. But when you pursue meaning, happiness ensues. Right? When you set your sights on meaning, which is more in your control, right? Because you can listen to your heart, and you can reflect on the right ways to achieve the things, or to pursue the kinds of realities that will make you not happy, but have a meaningful life. He says when we do that, happiness happens to us. Right? And what the problem is, if we don't pursue meaning, we pursue somebody else's idea of happiness. We think it's our own, right? But chances are we got it from a relative, a neighbor, a teacher, or likely, unfortunately, social media. The algorithms told us what will make us happy, right? How terrifying a thought is that, right? We're already living in the dystopia. But my algorithms tell me what's happy, and if I spend all my time thinking about that, or picking jobs that'll get me the money that will give me the thing that I think will make me happy, right? That's one way that plays itself out. Then we're going to find ourselves deeply dissatisfied. But if we pursue things that are meaningful to us, if we're willing to search, and recognize that a search is ongoing, right? There's real progress, but it doesn't end. But if we learn to search for meaningful things, meaningful people, meaningful callings in life, meaningful ways of serving others, that oftentimes in the middle of that, distracted as we are by the goods that we're trying to participate in, happiness will find us. And that's ultimately, I think, what we want in the end. So that's all I got, but I'm happy to have your questions.